Hello everyone, you're very welcome to this very special Professional Development Service for Teachers webinar to launch Young Economist of the Year 2021. I would like to thank Ciara O'Donnell, National Director of the PDST, and Sharon Kiley, Team Leader for Economics, for their ongoing support of this initiative. We'd like you to sit back now for the next while to listen to some inputs from a variety of our partners so that you can get some ideas and some insights to bring back to your students. So I'd like to hand you over now to Shane Kerwin, who is an economics advisor with PDST, who's going to give you some updates on supports and to give you his advice for YEOTY 2021.
Hello, my name is Shane Kerwin, and on behalf of the Professional Development Service for Teachers, the PDST, we're delighted to bring you this webinar in support of the Young Economist of the Year, a national award for the promotion and understanding of economics amongst our second level students. As an advisor with the PDST for post-primary programs and subjects, including economics, business and LTVP, I have the pleasure of working to support teacher professional development in these areas. And as part of today's webinars, I'd like to highlight some of the supports that the PDST offers in the area of economics. Over the last number of years, Young Economist of the Year has afforded us the opportunity to witness the curiosity, innovation and insight that students all across the country have demonstrated with their entries to the programme. Young Economist of the Year has gone from strength to strength since its inception in 2013. The annual National Awards ceremony is one of the key dates in the calendar for us here in the PDST, and we're never less than amazed by the energy and diversity that Ireland's young economists demonstrate through their entries to the programme. Of course, none of this would be possible were it not for the dedication and commitment of economics teachers who facilitate and encourage their students to enter this rewarding programme. In September 2019, the revised senior cycle specification for economics was introduced in post-primary schools. This specification aims to stimulate students' curiosity and interest in the economic environment and how they interact with it. In developing their understanding of economic knowledge, concepts and theories, students are equipped with a toolkit that empowers them to ask questions and critically evaluate different perspectives on issues of personal, local, national and global importance. Inequality, climate change, poverty, globalization. We've all seen in recent times how engaged Irish students are with these issues. And through the study of economics, students are empowered to understand and critique the economic forces which can affect their everyday lives. With its focus on authentic student inquiry and research, the YEOTY programme complements those very same key skills that senior cycle economics seeks to cultivate. PDST offers a range of professional development support for senior cycle economics, including full-day seminars, professional learning communities, webinars and the school support service. If you're not already registered to receive information about upcoming events, you can do so on the PDST website address highlighted on screen. The economics page on Schoolnet at schoolnet.ie/PDST/economics contains links to official documents such as the economic specification and research study guidelines, materials relating to previous CPD events, lists of useful websites, plus further information on Young Economist of the Year, and also a wealth of resources uploaded and shared by teachers, and these are all mapped to the relevant sections of the specification. They can be found also through the browse and search functions at the top of the page. Most recently, PDST Economics released Webinar 3, which is available to view from the link here on Schoolnet, along with our previous webinars. Webinar 3 revisited some of the key documents and supports that relate to the research study process. And Webinar 4 will be released shortly, and this webinar will feature Dr. Lisa Ryan of University College Dublin discussing how economic concepts and theories can provide insight into sustainable development. So we hope that you and your students enjoy your experience of the Young Economist of the Year programme, and we very much look forward to seeing you all again soon.
Thanks, Shane. I would now like to introduce our keynote speaker for the webinar, Dr. Miguel Pellicer. Miguel is an assistant professor at the Department of Economics in Maynooth University. Miguel's research focuses on social and economic inequality, political behaviour and development, and he has published widely on these topics. His motivation for his research is to try and understand why inequality persists and how it can be reduced. In this webinar, Miguel will talk about economic inequality, and he will be asking questions such as which types of distribution of resources is considered fair? How much inequality of opportunity is there in Ireland? How has economic inequality evolved in the last 30 years? Does it get worse during a crisis? And how relevant is discrimination and inequality between groups? So I hope you enjoy this presentation. It might give you some ideas to bring back to your students, but also nourish your understanding of inequality as well. So sit back now and enjoy the talk. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Miquel Pellicer. I'm assistant professor at the Department of Economics of Maynooth University. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to give this talk. I'm going to talk about economic inequality. It's, I think, a really important topic. I've been doing research about it for a long time. And also, sorry, I have taught courses about it. So I'm really, really glad to be talking about this today. So let me start with this picture. It's a picture taken in South Africa, in Johannesburg. I taught at the University of Cape Town for several years. And so I've done research on South Africa, and I'm a bit familiar with the country. South Africa is one of the most unequal countries in the world. And you can see some of this inequality in this picture, right? So you see, like, side by side, two areas divided by a road here. On the left, you have like big houses, lots of green and trees. You can see some swimming pools. On the left, you see basically shacks, like tiny shacks, right, with no trees at all. Here, there would be basically white people that live here. Here would be basically mostly black people that live. And the lives of the people on this left side are totally different than the lives of people in this in the right side. Right? So the people here would have like a lifestyle very similar to the affluent people here in Ireland. So they would have like a good healthcare, good education. They would live fairly long on average. They would have like amenities and assets, like own computers and cars and so on. Whereas the people here on the right side, they would have a standard of living like totally different. They would live less long. They would have like access to worse healthcare, worse education opportunities. They would own less things, like few of them would own a computer, for example. And these inequalities, right? So these differences, they lie side by side. And South Africa, as I say, is an extreme example. But I want to now next like bring you a little bit close to home, which is Dublin. So this is basically census data and a census map of the area of Dublin close to the Grand Canal. So this would be the Grand Canal. So this is a fancy area in Dublin. And this patch here is a small council area, right? Like where I used to go to play soccer, and it feels totally different from the one here. So here, for example, in the shade of blue tells you like how many households have a computer, and you can see that here around this fancy area, like 90% of households have a computer, whereas in this council area, like only 40% do. So the differences are not so big as in South Africa, but they are still really striking. And so these are the type of differences I'm going to be talking about, this economic inequality. And so I'm going to be dealing with three main types of questions. The first one is about fairness. Is inequality fair or unfair? The second is about what has happened to inequality. How has it evolved, like about measurement and the evolution of inequality. And the third is about what drives inequality. and I'm going to focus on group inequality and discrimination. Okay, so this topic and all these three topics, like, they are huge topics, and so 40 minutes is very little to talk about these things, but I'm going to try to give some summary of important things that we know about these topics, and then zoom into some things I think could be interesting for your students to research on. Okay, so let me start with the first question. Is inequality unfair? This is the map of the US. Many of you might be like now familiar to it, with it. It's the map of the results of the elections. It was a very intense and dramatic election, right? And you see the outcome of it is a really polarized society with these blue states, the Democratic states, and Republican states, the red states, right? And so people talk a lot about this very intense and extreme polarization. And a lot of this polarization has to do with fairness of inequality, right? So is the society, so which type of society they think they should have and how to achieve it, right? So there's huge disagreements and polarization about that. So I want to then spend some minutes thinking about what is the origin of this disagreement and if something can be done about it. And the first thing I want to note is that this question of whether inequality in our society is fair or unfair has two different components. The first component is how would be in an ideal society economic inequality, right? So what do you think should inequality be in an ideal fair society, right? And this in some sense is a normative philosophical question, right? About what's the ideal type of society. And people may disagree about that. But the second question is different, is the society we live in, how close it is to that ideal, right? And people may have the same ideal, but they may differ and disagree on how close do they think the society they live in is to that ideal, right? And this is an empirical question. This is about how inequality is in the society we live in, whereas it's not a normative philosophical question, okay? And in some sense, one could think that something could be done about this, because if it's about empirics, right, maybe like research could help like elucidating and closing differences in this realm. So let's see. So let me first start with the first question about these normative approaches. And there are three basic views on distributive justice I want to talk about. I'm going to talk about it very briefly. The first one is the libertarian approach, right? The main thinker there is Robert Nozick from the US from the 70s. And there, the idea is that inequality doesn't really matter if rights and freedoms are respected, right? So all you have to do is make sure that people are free, and then they will do what they have to do, and the outcome doesn't matter. What is important is the process. This is a bit of an extreme approach, but it's one possible approach. Another very common approach in economics certainly is utilitarian, which is the ideal society is the one that has the maximum possible well-being, right? So what we should try to do is to maximize this total well-being. And this utilitarian perspective has a very interesting implication about inequality. Because on the one hand, inequality of well-being doesn't matter, right? So if you have a society with slaves that have very little well-being and slave owners that have very high well-being, and then you compare it to another society where everyone has some intermediate level of well-being, right? So you would be indifferent between the two. You wouldn't think that the one with slavery is worse, right? Because they all achieve the same total well-being. So in that sense, utilitarianism doesn't care about inequality. But in another sense, it cares a lot about inequality. And it considers that inequality of income is bad. And the reason, this is actually one of the most powerful philosophical arguments against inequality, is that income is typically worth more for a poor person than for a rich person. And so this means that if we give income if the rich person gives income to the poor person, total well-being increases. Okay, so this is a powerful argument for inequality from a normative point of view. Okay, and then the third approach is equality of opportunity. This basically comes from or originates in Rawls, another American philosopher from the 70s. And the idea here is that everyone should have the opportunity to carry out their life plan, right? But at the same time, personal responsibility is also important. Okay, so this means that people should have equal opportunities, but then afterwards, they should be responsible to what happens afterwards. Okay, so what this means is that different types of inequalities should be judged differently. So inequalities that come from circumstances or from privilege where you are born, this should be unfair. So this implies that you don't have the same opportunities. But those that come from effort are okay, because these are related to personal responsibility. Okay. Now, the equality of opportunity approach, I think, is the most common approach now considered. Let me show you now what people generally think about this. So I want to show you some data from a survey, the European Social Survey, that asks questions to a representative sample of people in different European countries, including Ireland. And it asks lots of interesting questions about these kind of things we are talking about inequality and so on. So these are the questions that I have selected on these normative issues I just talked about. So, and particularly about equality of opportunity. So the question here would be, do you agree that a society where hardworking people earn more would be a fair society? This is this graph here. And here you have people that agree, strongly agree, neither agree nor disagree, or disagree or strongly disagree. And what you can see is that most people agree. So most people think that inequality, if it comes from hard work, is justified. Okay. Now look at this graph here. This is the answer to the question whether a society that gives privileges to high status people is fair or not. And here you can see that most people rather disagree with that. Right, so again, so this corresponds to the inequality of opportunity approach, right? So inequalities due to hard work should be fine, right? But inequalities due to circumstances or these privileges are not fair. And indeed, most of the people disagree with that. Although I have to say, Ireland in that respect is a bit of an outlier, because in other European countries, there's much more disagreement than in Ireland. But still, there's quite a lot of disagreement. So what I want to point out with this is that there's quite a lot of agreement regarding these normative questions. So there's not everyone agrees, but there's quite a lot of agreement that we would like a society where people have equality of opportunity, but we want people to take responsibility and work hard as well if they want more income. Now let me go to the second step, which is, I told you the first was normative about the ideal type of society. The second is more empirical about which type of society are we living in. So are opportunities equally distributed in Ireland? Okay. So this is the answer to another question of this European Social Survey about this. A question is about how fair do you think is the actual wealth distribution in Ireland? And here you have fair, it's fair. Here you think it's not fair, but it's actually too small. And this is not fair, it's too big. Right. So here is basically split half-half. So 25% of the people think that is fair, and then the rest of the 25% here think that is okay, it's not fair because it's too small. But the other 50% think that there's too much inequality and that is unfair the extent of inequality in Ireland is too big and is unfairly too big. Okay, so the point I'm trying to make here is that whereas there's quite a lot of agreement on the ideal type of society regarding inequality, at least in broad strokes, that we should reward effort, but we shouldn't reward privilege and birth and circumstances. There's a lot of disagreement regarding the actual system in Ireland or in any country for that matter, whether it's fair or not. Okay, and as I said, that which is the empirical question. Okay, so there's a lot of disagreement here. Another example of this from the US, and linked to this political polarization I was talking about in the beginning. So this is data from the Pew Research Center that also fields these surveys on attitudes. And it's another way of asking about whether they think that the actual distribution in the US is fair or not. So here they ask, why do you think a person is poor? Is it because of lack of effort or circumstances beyond their control in the US? And you see that again, so half of the people, a bunch of people think that it's because of circumstance. Another big chunk, 30% in this case, think that is about effort. When they ask, why is a person rich? So again, this is a split, like half, more or less, the same amount of people think that someone is rich in the US because he has had advantages in life. And another big chunk thinks that it's because they worked hard. So again, a lot of disagreement here. And then what is interesting is that this disagreement is very correlated with political opinions, right? So the Republicans or Republican-leaning people tend to think that the people are poor because they don't make effort, and the people are rich because they work hard, right? So they think that inequality in the US comes from hard work. Whereas Democrats think the other way around. They think that in the US, inequality comes from circumstances beyond control, right? So either advantages or circumstances. All right. So again, to summarize, I think these disagreements are really critical. And I think that the point I'm trying to make is that I think that a lot of these disagreements come from something that we could study empirically. And I think that this is what makes partly also the research like relevant. So the question is, what do we know about actual inequality of opportunity, right? And here, so it turns out that it's actually hard to research, but we do know some things. So I just want to show you this graph. It's from Ireland. It includes Ireland. It basically is a graph that shows you the correlation of education between fathers and sons, right? So in different countries, right? Denmark, Italy, Ireland, and so on. Okay. So what does that measure? This measures the extent of inequality of opportunity. Why? Because if we think that we adhere to equality of opportunity, we would think that the part of inequality that comes from circumstances is not fair, right? And a big part of your circumstances you don't have control over are your parents. So if your education depends strongly on the education of your parents, this means that circumstances were relevant for you. If there's no link, if regardless of your origin, you have the same chances of obtaining university or not, then this means that there's quite a lot of inequality of opportunity. Okay, so the correlation measures the degree of inequality of opportunity. Okay, the correlation is basically how much linked they are, right? The education of in this case, it's going to be fathers and sons. So how closely linked they are. And so you can see here that there's some variation in this. It's like, so you see that Denmark Yeah, Great Britain, but that is a bit of an outlier here. But basically, Denmark, New Zealand, Finland, Norway. So Nordic countries tend to have quite low inequality of opportunity, so quite a lot of equality of opportunity. So you can obtain education even if your parents were not, didn't go to university. And here you have the ones that have the most inequality. This includes the US and Ireland and Switzerland. And so these are countries where actually, whether your father, in this case, went to university or not, matters a great deal for predicting whether you will or not. So they would say there's fairly little inequality of opportunity, fairly little equality of opportunity. Okay, so let me then close this part of the talk. So, is inequality unfair? So I think this is a really important topic. I think it's really important to understand why do people disagree. And I think it's a type of, there are type of projects that students can do where they can really collect their own data. They can ask the people in their social networks about their attitudes and their opinions, and end up like analyzing data and doing very interesting like work, just like generating tables, doing very easy data work. But I think that is really interesting to try to understand, yeah, why do people disagree about these distributive justice judgments? Like, why do some people think that privileges are okay? I mean, this I think is I was really surprised, right? So the privilege of high status people are okay. Some people seem to think that. Why is that? Why do people think, like, what drives these differences also in beliefs, like this big disagreement whether you think that actually effort is what drives inequality in Ireland, and other people think that no, it's not effort, it's circumstances, and so on. I think this is really important and interesting to research. And then what I was hinting at the beginning is like one thing that could be done, I think would be really interesting, is like if you give evidence on actual inequality of opportunity, do people change their minds and their political opinions? So in some sense, do like our research, like can it help narrowing these differences? And also we actually know little about the extent of inequality of opportunity. It's hard to research, but I'm giving you like some pointers for how one can go about it. So yeah, so here are basically the readings I would suggest to you to introduce the different topics, some about normative approaches, some about the actual empirical inequality of opportunity. And then also a link to the data set that I've been using, the European Social Survey, that is available for everyone. All right, second theme, the evolution of inequality. So here I hear lots of people, regardless, like everywhere, thinking the rich are getting richer, the poor are getting poorer, as if it was something that holds true always and everywhere. And I think that part of this research on inequality is there to try to bring the data, right? And to see, is that really true or not? When is true? Where is it true? So I want to give you some what we know about this, like the very basic stylized facts that we know about this. So one piece is about the evolution of wage inequality in recent decades. And here, there's quite strong consensus that at least in OECD countries, so this is a club of, say, rich countries, inequality has gone up since the 80s. And here you have a graph that shows this. So what it shows is basically the change in wage inequality. So this is inequality in terms of labor income, of wages, right? So the differences between those that earn more and those that earn less in wages. And this is the change from the 70s and 80s until the late 2000s. And so if these little dots or diamonds are here over the 0 bar, it means that inequality has increased. So these are the different countries: Poland, Hungary, Great Britain, France, Ireland, and so on. And so what you see is that in most countries, inequality has gone up. Okay, so the change in inequality has been positive. Inequality has increased, okay, in most countries. So in this case, not in all, but in most. But in this case, it is true, this thing that the rich have been getting richer and the poor have been getting poorer. Now, why is that? So this is a massive topic where there has been lots of research. I want to give you a very brief summary of the main explanations that are around. There are two main types of explanations. One that has to do with markets, and the other that has to do with institutions. And all are true to a certain extent. So the one that centers on markets has to do with demand for skills and demand for educated workers, right? So the idea is that what has actually been happening is that the premium of high education has been increasing over time. So having high education has always given a premium, has always given you extra income. But this premium has been increasing over time. And this has to do with market forces. Okay, so this is the first type of explanation. And it's because there has been an increased demand for skills since the 80s. And there are two forces that are typically considered. One is globalization, right? So the idea here is that with globalization, there has been a specialization of rich OECD countries in industries and products that require high skills, right? So highly educated people. And so this means that the demand for these workers has increased, whereas the demand for the low-skilled workers has gone down because now all these activities have been outsourced to poorer countries, right? So this implies that here at the OECD, there's more demand and therefore there's a premium. The firms really want to hire these highly skilled workers, and therefore their value goes up, and then the difference in wages between the high skilled and the lower skilled goes up as well. So this is the globalization story. Another story is called the skill bias technological change. Sorry, there's a typo here. So what this tells is that since the 70s or 80s, the technology has evolved, particularly with computerization, IT, and so on, in a way that benefits those with high skills. So this means that people with high skills are now, thanks to these technological changes, are now more productive because they are the ones that use the computers. And so therefore, this implies because they are more productive, then they get paid more. So this is the market story, okay? But next to this, there are stories that have to do more with institutions. And people point out that there has been a strong decline in unionization. So unions are much less powerful than they used to be in the 70s. And with this goes typically an increase in inequality because unions tend to compress the wage distribution. And also people have advanced the idea that social norms are important, particularly at the very top of the distribution, which I will come back now in a moment, so that the pay of the CEOs has increased dramatically, particularly in some countries. So that before there were social norms that were like keeping these wages at the high level. They were high, but there was a limit to them. But at some point in the 80s, the social norms changed, and then these astronomical wages are now like accepted socially. All right, so this is then what I want to say about the increasing wage inequality in recent decades. But there's another story, also very interesting, which is about the long run. It's something that comes from recent research, mainly from or inspired by Piketty, who wrote this bestseller of Capital in the 20th Century about inequality. He's really a great researcher. And so he collected data on top incomes going back far into the past, to the beginning of the 20th century. And this has become a project that many people have taken up. And so we have found like lots of interesting things, and these two graphs summarize, I think, a lot of the interesting things that we have found. And one is that so what I show in these graphs is the share of income of the top 1%. So this is the richest people. Which share of income do they get, right? And so the first thing is that you can see here that in the beginning of the 20th century, these top 1% were getting a lot of the income generated in the economy. So around 20%, look at this. This is the Anglo-Saxon countries, this is continental Europe. Around 20% of all the income generated was going to just this richest 1%. This is the first thing. The second thing is that everywhere this share, so inequality in this sense, right, went down dramatically over the course of the first half of the 20th century, from around 20% to around 10%. Like here you can see it as well. And it remained down, and it continued going down, remained down like all through the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And then in Anglo-Saxon countries, but only in Anglo-Saxon countries, then it has been going back up like very strongly, but not in continental Europe, or not so much. Okay. So this is really one important story, that the rich are not always getting richer and the poor poorer. There was a moment during the 50s, 60s, and 70s where inequality was really low everywhere. And then only in Anglo-Saxon countries, it has then gone back up. So why is that? And particularly, why did inequality fall so dramatically in the first half of the 20th century? So again, I just want to say a couple of main things. The main thing is that this decrease was not an issue of capital. Was not an issue of wages, as we saw before. It has to do with capital, with big fortunes, with people that have money and were getting like rents or owned like machines or firms, and were getting like rents and income from owning these things, this capital. And what happened is that over the 20th century, the beginning of the 20th century, the first half of the 20th century, there were these big fortunes that disappeared and did not recover, right? And what happened, the consensus is that during the world wars and the Great Depression, there was a lot of destruction of capital. And that this implied, because people had less capital, these big fortunes, then they had less to draw rents from, right? So then their income went down, and this made the inequality go down, right? But what happened afterwards was that these big fortunes did not recuperate, right? They didn't recover. And the reason was that taxes were very high after the Second World War. And so it would have taken, it was taking a long time to reaccumulate capital because taxes were high. And so this is why after the Second World War, inequality in the sense of these top incomes remained low for a long time, right? And then what is also very interesting is that this research has shown that the increase in inequality that we see in the top incomes, right, in Anglo-Saxon countries from the 1980s is not about capitalists, again, like starting to accumulate big fortunes. No, it's mainly about wages. So what we have precisely are these CEOs, lawyers and doctors and so on that are earning a lot of like wages, right? But a lot of wages. But what this like research also suggests is that there's the risk that now that taxes are going down everywhere, these big fortunes are restarting to be accumulated. And so we might end up with very high inequality down the line. All right. So this is what I wanted to say about what we know. Then there's another topic I wanted to bring about this evolution of inequality, which has to do with crisis. And so the question I wanted to put there is like, what do you think happens to inequality during crisis? And most people think that inequality increases during crisis. So I asked my students what do they think happened to inequality during the financial crisis in 2008? And most of them thought that inequality had gone up. And I think that's quite a common perception. But in reality, that's not the case, or at least the data that we have don't seem to be in accordance with that view. So here is the data for these top incomes for Ireland from 1980 to now recently. And you see this increase that I was saying of the top incomes in Anglo-Saxon countries, right? But you see here, this is basically 2008. And you can see that precisely during the crisis, at the crisis, inequality went down. And then afterwards, it basically recovered with the recovery afterwards, okay? So it's the other way around as what people tend to perceive. Inequality actually went down with the crisis. And this doesn't seem to be an outlier, so a unique case, right? So if you look at the Great Depression in the US, so this is just the top 1%. So it's again the top 1%, right? So the richest, so how rich they were. And the Great Depression was during the 30s. So it started with the 1929 Wall Street crash, and then lasted throughout the 30s. And you see here a similar pattern. It went down, inequality went down with the crisis, and then stayed down, and then went up in the recovery, okay? So there may be something there about inequality generally going down with crisis. So how does that lead us regarding the current COVID crisis? So there's like the common perception is that inequality has gone up, that the crisis have affected mainly those like that are poorer, right? So that it has made inequality go up. So is that true or not? And it seems that for the case of the COVID crisis, so it's too early to tell, no, we need more data. But from what we know, it seems that no, that in this case, it is correct. The perception is correct. So this is the Gini coefficient, is another way of measuring inequality in Spain during the COVID crisis. And this basically shows you, so like this is February, March, April, and May. And the blue line is the Gini coefficient before government intervention. And this is the Gini coefficient, the inequality, after taking into account the government transfers. And what you can see is that indeed there was a large increase in inequality during the lockdown, right? So inequality did increase in this case. But you also see here that part of this inequality has been like reduced, right? Or the government intervention has managed to cushion some of this inequality. So when you consider inequality including government transfers, the increase is much smaller, okay? So it seems that the crisis indeed increased inequality, but the government has not done a very, very bad job, right, in reducing this bad impact. Okay, so evolution of inequality. So as I say, there's lots of research on measuring inequality and how and why it has changed. I'm giving you again like later some readings to then sort of dig into this literature. But I think that there are some interesting questions there about inequality during crisis. So precisely, do people hold inaccurate perceptions about inequality during crisis, that people think that always inequality increases in crisis? And that was not the case apparently in the 2008 financial crisis. And I think that there are lots of potential nice projects about the COVID crisis, like why is it different from previous crises, and also to collect some data and dig into what has happened, who has like suffered most in the context of Ireland. Okay, so and here you have like some suggested readings and the databases that people can use to to look at inequality in different countries and in different points in time. Okay, so my time is sort of running out. I have said I would do 40 minutes. I have one more theme to talk about. So I'm going to proceed, and then one can see what we do in the webinar as such. The last thing I wanted to talk about is about group inequality and discrimination. This is also, I think, a very relevant topic and very controversial, because many people are convinced that there's a lot of discrimination, and many people think that there's no discrimination at all. Again, a lot of disagreement. So let me start showing you a group inequality, right? So like the gender wage gap, so the differences in wages between men and women in different countries from the 70s until now. And you see that the differences are big. They have been decreasing over time, but they're still big. So on average now, still men earn around 20% more than women. And here you have the race wage gap in the US. So the difference between white workers and black workers for men and for women. And you see that this is from the 60s until the 2000s. But the main point here is that it decreased during the 70s, the 60s and 70s, but then it has remained quite stable. Okay, so, and again, the differences for males are still very big also, like around 15-20%. So there are big differences between these groups. And the question, where do they come from? What explains these big differences? And there are two basic building blocks. One is that they come from the choices that people make. So, for example, the women tend to study sort of subjects, right, that end up giving lower income, lower wages down the line, right? So they tend to study less like science subjects, right, which pay off a lot. And this is their choice. And they also take career breaks so that in the end, so the income doesn't grow so much. Regarding race differentials in the US and in many places, Black people tend to obtain less education than white people. So again, so some people would say then, yeah, okay, so these are their choices, their investment choices, that's why there are differences, right? And the other side is that there is discrimination. And what in economics people mostly talk about is labor market discrimination, which is that in addition to these differences in education or career paths, women and Black people are treated differently at the labor market. So these are the two main building blocks. But the third one that I think is increasingly taken into consideration is that discrimination actually affects investment and labor market choices, right? So it can be that discrimination, so part of what we see here of these differences come from discrimination. So this is a bit what I want to talk about. So I want to talk just about labor market discrimination, about some evidence that now has been found that is really uncontroversial about the existence of labor market discrimination. So this type of studies, they're called CV studies, and they come from these two researchers. They started the trend in 2004 with a paper. What they did was to send CVs to vacancies, real existing job vacancies in the US. And what they did was to send CVs that were the same, exactly the same. They were fake, but in one case, the name was a white-sounding name, like Greg or Emily, and in another case, with exactly the same CV, it was an African-American sounding name, like Jamal or Lakeisha. And what they found is that it's the same CV, just the name changes. The white-sounding names got like 1 callback per 10 CVs that they sent, but the African-American sounding names got 1 only out of 15 that they sent. So this means that the callback rate was 50% lower for the African Americans. So this is really a pretty massive amount of discrimination. So just because they think, no, you sound African American, regardless of your CV, I don't call you. And then since then, there has been lots of evidence of labor market discrimination against different groups, like indigenous in Peru versus white people, Turkish in Germany, Arab in the Netherlands, and also sexual orientation, like gay versus straight. So I think now there's really uncontroversial evidence of that this labor market discrimination exists. Now I wanted to talk about something else. So people normally, one of the reasons why I think that there's such controversy regarding discrimination is because many people don't feel discriminated against, and they feel that they are not racist, and they feel that people are generally, there are some racist people, crazy people, but that generally people are more or less normal and they are not racist, right? And one line of research that I find really interesting that has sort of put into question these things is, or at least it gives lots of food for thought, is research on social psychology on implicit prejudice. So the idea here is that people may hold unconscious prejudices that they don't realize, but that matter for behavior. And so these psychologists have developed a test to try to measure this implicit prejudice, called this implicit attention test. It's something that anyone can do. And so the idea of the test is to measure implicit prejudice by how slow you are to associate categories. So for example, black and good. So the way it works is they give you a screen like this. They have here categories, bad or black people, and here good or white people. And here you get images, and you have to then sort them. So this, for example, would be the image of a black person. You would put it in the bad or black people here. If it was like a baby, so you would say, that's a good thing, you would put it here. And what they do is the idea is that if you have these implicit prejudices, for you it's very easy and very fast to sort good and white together and bad and black together, right? So you say baby, good, white person, good, very fast, very easy. But if they switch the categories around and they give you good and black person and bad and white person, if you have this implicit prejudice, then this is harder for you. So it was like, okay, so then you have the baby, it was like good or black, and then the black person is good or so, and this takes longer. And even if you try, it's just unconscious, right? And I did this test when I was in South Africa, and I was blown away. I generally consider myself not a racist person at all, but I could feel how it was harder for me to sort the black and good relative to the white and good. And for me, it was a really transformative experience. And I think this is something that is really useful for people to be aware of these things. And so this test can be done for precisely prejudice and race, but it also can be done like to look for stereotypes, for example, about precisely science or math versus arts for male and female, right? So to see whether people hold the stereotypes that then female are good for arts and men are good for science and maths. It's the same idea. So, but the idea here is that, that doesn't mean that you are a bad person or that you are a racist, right? So, but it means that we have these implicit prejudices, and even if we don't realize, sometimes it may show up, right? And so it's really important also to realize. And so what have this type of test delivered? So these are the results I wanted to point out. So here are for the race prejudice. This is how much longer it takes to associate black and good relative to white and good, right? So this is your degree of white bias, if you want, right? So you can see that most people have this white bias. They tend to associate white with good. But some people have zero bias, and some people have black bias. They tend to associate black with good, implicitly, unconsciously. This is for white respondents. But what is really interesting is that when you look at Black respondents, so the pattern is not the same. So you have more Black preference, but there's still a lot of Black respondents that have white preference. And down here are the results for gender stereotypes, gender science stereotypes. And the result here is even stronger. So there's a lot of like unconscious linking of men and science by males and also by females. Okay, so these stereotypes are really there and really like not everyone has them, but many people have them. Okay, the last thing I want to talk about, this thing that I mentioned at the beginning when talking about this group inequality, about the consequences of discrimination and the idea that discrimination may affect your choices that you take and your productivity. And there's also from social psychology a sort of set of results and empirical evidence for a phenomenon that I think is really also interesting. It's called stereotype threat. And the idea here is that when a group is negatively stereotyped, for example, as being like lazy or unproductive, it actually generates anxiety and can make the group more unproductive. Just the fact of having these negative stereotypes, facing these stereotypes. So this is the threat of this stereotype. So the idea is that it creates this anxiety that disrupts cognitive performance. And there's lots of evidence of this effect going on. So there are lots of experiments that psychologists have been done where basically they give African Americans tests and white people tests, like cognitive tests, and when they prime race, African Americans tend to do worse. Okay, and there's one type of result, one study that is really interesting in that direction that now has to do also with these women and math stereotypes. So it has to do, is done with Asiatic American women. So in the US, Asiatic people have the stereotype of being very good at maths and science, but women have the stereotype of being bad at maths and science. And so they took this group of Asiatic females, and to a bunch of them, they made their Asian identity salient. To others, they didn't prime any identity, and to others, they gave the female identity salient. And then they gave the science sort of test. And what you see is that those that got the Asian identity salient, they did better than those that didn't get any identity salient, and the ones that got the female identity salient, they did worse. So again, this is evidence that stereotypes matter for how you perform in tests, and this affects then your career paths and your education paths, and down the line your choices and your productivity. Okay, so now to finalize everything. So I think it would be really interesting to examine this discrimination in the context of Ireland, like which groups, which gender stereotypes are there. And one can really measure these implicit attitudes, and one can ask different people to do these tests and get these results. For example, like, do young people here in Ireland have different stereotypes regarding women than old people, implicit stereotypes? And then one can then relate these implicit attitudes to positions towards policies, like, for example, affirmative action or something like that. So I think this is, again, like some type of projects where students could collect data and generate very interesting analysis. And here, like, I gave you, again, like some readings and sources. So you can take these implicit attention tests here. And they're like some readings on discrimination from economics and from psychology. And yes, I think that's all I wanted to say. Sorry, it has taken a long time. But yeah, I hope you found some of the things I was saying interesting, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Miguel. That was a very interesting presentation and definitely food for thought. I would now like to introduce some of our partners in YEOTY to talk about special interest awards that they will be sponsoring. We will first hear from Associate Professor Trivana Pastine, who is the head of the Department of Economics at Maynooth University. We will then hear from Tara McIndoe-Calder, who is an economist with the Central Bank of Ireland. And finally, we will hear from Yasmina Behan, who is the head of IGEES, the Irish Government Economic and Evaluation Service.
Hi, I'm Trivana Pastine from the Department of Economics at Maynooth University, and I'm here to announce that we are delighted to participate in the PDST Young Economist Award 2021. This year, we have a special interest award. We would like the young economists to write about the effects of COVID-19 on income inequality in Ireland and its likely long-term consequences. There can be individual submissions, or students can go into groups of 2 or 3 students and submit as a group. There will be a cash award for the best projects of the year. The details of the competition will be announced on the website of youngeconomist.ie. I hope to see you at the award ceremony.
Thanks, Trivana. Thanks also for the resource on the minimum wage that you have designed and shared with us that is aimed specifically at secondary school students. We will make this resource available at our youngeconomist.ie website. It is very interesting to see you interview one of your own former students, Dr. Paul Redmond, who is now a researcher at the ESRI. And also you talk to one of your colleagues, a leading researcher in the area of labour market economics, Professor Donal O'Neill. And Donal talks about the impact of minimum wage on inequality. So it's a very interesting resource, and we're going to share it with students and teachers on our youngeconomist.ie website. I'd also like to thank Professor Rowena Pecanino for sharing a resource on how to do research properly. Rowena has prepared sheets for teachers with lists of reliable sources of information. She's also designed a PowerPoint presentation on things like checking facts and how to reference your resources correctly. So all of these resources will be on our website, youngeconomist.ie. So thanks to Maynooth University for their ongoing support of Young Economist.
Hello, my name is Tara McIndoe-Calder and I'm an economist at the Central Bank. The Central Bank of Ireland is delighted to participate once again in the Professional Development Services for Teachers Young Economist of the Year, YEOTY, competition. Our thanks to the Department of Education, PDST, and the YEOTY Working Group for their continued work on this competition. In sponsoring the Central Bank of Ireland Young Economist of the Year Award, we seek to discover and highlight the huge talent of emerging young economists in Ireland. Applications to the Young Economist of the Year competition, which touch on our work or which focus on the euro area economy, are considered for the Central Bank of Ireland Award. The Central Bank has a very varied remit, and a wide range of economics-related questions are relevant to our work. For example, projects might explore issues relating to the Irish economy or to monetary policy. You can find out more about our mandate at www.centralbank.ie. Last year, our team of economists reviewed over 50 submissions for the Central Bank of Ireland Award. We were very impressed by the quality of the entries. These projects were judged according to 3 criteria: relevance of the work of the Central Bank of Ireland, originality and content, including the research questions addressed, motivation, methodology, policy conclusions, and referencing. The standard and quality of these projects for the 2020 competition far exceeded our expectations. The Central Bank of Ireland Award includes a specially designed medal and a bursary of €500. We also hope to welcome the winning students to the Central Bank for a 2-week work placement, COVID-19 restrictions permitting. We would encourage students to be brave in forming their conclusions after analysing their chosen topics and to think carefully about the policy relevance of their findings. We very much look forward to seeing this year's applications and wish all participating students and schools the very best of luck.
Hi, I'm Yasmina Behan from the Irish Government Economic and Evaluation Service, IGEES. IGEES is a community of over 250 economists and policy analysts within the Irish civil service. IGEES has a presence in each government department. Since 2012, we have been championing an evidence-informed approach to public policy design and implementation so that we have better policy outcomes and value for money for Irish citizens, as well as helping to drive reform in the public service. Our vision is a firmly embedded culture of evidence-informed public policy making in the Irish civil service. Our work centres on the use of data to produce insights for policymakers. Recently, we have been very busy using data to support the government in shaping Ireland's policy response to COVID-19. We're working on questions like how has COVID-19 and the introduction of public health measures impacted on our enterprise-based sectors of the economy and the labour market. But we're also trying to provide insights regarding other important questions, such as what export and what import sectors are vulnerable to Brexit and what policy options are there to deal with this. Or on housing policy, what is the best way to provide social housing? Is it through building houses or acquiring or leasing from the private market? Or supporting individuals and their families through income supports? Or on macroeconomic policy, do we know where in the business cycle the Irish economy is, given such a large presence of the multinational companies? Can we estimate the output gap for Ireland, and is the EU methodology adequate for Ireland? Or on the healthcare policy, is the state cost of medicines per capita higher than it should be? How successful are we in rebalancing the acute and primary healthcare? What is the cost of medical and GP visitation cards? Or how are demographic changes impacting on demand for education, healthcare, social protection, childcare, and other public services? If you care about these and other policy questions and would like to use your skills to help answer them and help improve our policy response to the economic and social challenges we face, and make Ireland a better place for all, consider IGEES as a career choice. We want our work to enrich the debate on how policy should respond to challenges facing the Irish economy and society. And a lot of what we do is published online, and you can find our papers on igees.gov.ie. We also have regular IGEES policy discussion seminars and conferences, as well as present our work in other relevant policy fora, such as the Dublin Economic Workshop, Irish Economic Association, and other. We work closely with the Central Statistics Office and their network of statisticians, which allows us to access important data sets. Importantly, working in government departments, we have access to large administrative data sets held by departments and their agencies. We collaborate with other research agencies such as the Economic and Social Research Institute and academia, but also international organizations such as the OECD. So what we do is very important and has a great sense of purpose.
Thank you to Vanna, Tara and Yasmina. We really appreciate your ongoing support with YEOTY every year. I'm now going to hand you over to the judges to talk about some of the things they're looking out for in YEOTY projects. So first up is Dr. Brian O'Boyle, who is the Economic Programme Director in St Angela's, NUI Galway. And then we will hear from Dr. Kevin Denny from the School of Economics in UCD.
Hi, my name is Brian O'Boyle. I'm an economist and one of the judges on the Young Economist of the Year. This is a quick video to give advice to people who may be thinking of entering next year. The bedrock of any successful entry is the combination of interest and relevance. If it's interesting to you and relevant to the wider economics community, it will allow you to sustain yourself over the number of weeks that it will take to produce a good project. Secondly, because economics is a very concept-driven discipline, it's important, if at all possible, to link your project to key concepts from the economics curriculum. Thirdly, economics is also an empirical discipline. In other words, it tries to take key concepts and test them against information, knowledge, data in the world. So if you can do that, well, then you have a very good basis for a project. So in other words, if you have relevance and interest, if you have key concepts embedded in the center of your project, and you have a way of testing your information, it'll give you the best chance to be successful. A recent example that encapsulated those three aspects was Bob Kim's project from 2018. In 2018, in Rockwell College, Bob investigated the behavior of his fellow classmates around lunch break, in particular about how they made their way to the canteen. What he found was those students who ran to the canteen saved on average 8 minutes per day in terms of their lunch break, and therefore they had an extra 8 minutes to enjoy themselves or to relax over lunch. When Bob knew this, he then asked 100 students, split into two groups of 50 each, is it rational to run to the canteen? Crucially, though, he held the information back from one group and let the other group know the information. So when one group was asked, is it rational to run to the canteen, they didn't know that you saved yourself 8 minutes, and therefore very few of them said it was rational. When, however, the second group were told the information, the responses completely shifted, and a lot of people said it was rational to run. And so what this did was it showed us as judges that Bob was very, very innovative in the way he thought about economics. He was able to take key concepts like rationality, choice, information, and to bring them to bear on an actual investigation. And so, if you're looking to emulate that, what you're trying to do then, as I've said already, is to link your project as much as you can to key concepts that can be tested. I hope this was helpful for people. Good luck next year.
Hi, my name is Kevin Denny, and I'm an associate professor at the School of Economics in University College Dublin. And I've been a judge at the Young Economist of the Year competition for 3 years now. And every year I'm impressed with the quality of the projects, the range of topics that students work on, and it just shows great imagination and enthusiasm. And that's why I'm delighted to continue being involved in this project. So I wanted to say a few words about what makes a good project. And this is my personal take, because different judges will have, different emphasis, but this is my view. I think there's several factors that go to make a great project. The first, and this is something I impress on my own students here who are starting research projects, is to have a research question. That is, there should be a what or a how or a why driving your research. So what will be the effect of COVID-19 on educational inequalities? How do firms persuade customers to switch brands? Why are some countries unable to escape poverty? Right? Questions like that. The second thing is that you need to convince the judges that this is an important or an interesting question. So, you might be interested in online gaming or fast fashion, but you have to sell the idea. You have to market the idea to whoever's going to be looking at it, right? So, you got to try and put this in context. So, you might be very interested in fast fashion, but chances are your judges may not have heard of it or are not familiar with it. So you've got to put it in this context to sell the idea. The third thing is attention to detail. Be very clear what your sources are, where information is coming from, what do those numbers mean, how are you interpreting them, using nice graphics. And I often see presentations in YEOTY which reveal real skill and imagination. And so that's something that, you've got to make it look good. Finally, and this won't be possible for every project, and we'd expect this more from, say, students in the senior cycle, but if you can, collect data. We've had some great projects which have won prizes where students went out and did some experiment. Or maybe they collected a survey. Right? Now, you might need to talk to your teacher about doing this first, but it is a really great way to learn. So I look forward to seeing your projects, and I wish you all the best.
Thanks, Brian and Kevin. So, Young Economist of the Year is all about the students, and I'm absolutely delighted to be able to introduce you to 3 students who performed very well in YEOTY 2020. So first, we will hear from the Junior Young Economist of the Year 2020, Tom Knobloch, and Tom is from St. Brendan's College in Killarney. We will then hear from Julia Baratta from St. Andrew's College in Dublin, and Julia won the Central Bank of Ireland Award 2020. And then we will hear from the overall 2020 Young Economist of the Year, Fuelon Campbell from Coláiste Oriel in Monaghan.
Hello, my name is Tom Knobloch, and I'm a transition year student in St. Brendan's College, Killarney. For each of the past 3 years, I've submitted a project to the Young Economist of the Year, having first been made aware of the competition by my older brother. I've seen the competition grow. I've enjoyed doing my economic investigations, and I've been fortunate enough to be physically present at judging and award ceremonies in the past. I've always had a great interest in how things work, both from a physical perspective and from an intangible perspective, such as why people behave in particular ways. I will most likely do economics for the Leaving Certificate and would love to pursue a career in the financial sector, possibly as an economist. I chose to research a topic that was of both interest to me and relevant to my generation. Increasingly, we see the impact of man's interference on our planet at a macro level through examples such as the massive fires in California and numerous major floods and droughts, and I sought to understand how this relates to me at a micro level, both in its impact and in my ability to influence it. The idea for my project came from listening to my father talk about how he would make our house more energy efficient. He wondered whether he should pump the walls with insulation, change the windows and doors, or insulate the attic. His main issue was that he did not know where to start. I thought that it would be a great idea if there was an independent, accredited agency that advised homeowners on the best measures to improve energy efficiency in their homes, and to help provide information on available government grant aid. People want to reduce their CO2 emissions. Helping them on their way should be a priority for the government. My project required a large amount of research. As with any project, I was forced to use both primary and secondary sources. I used interviews, desk-based research, and statistical analysis. I found government papers that related to this topic, as well as general articles on areas such as the behavioral impact of taxation. Throughout the process, I learned many things. Among my learnings was that the discovery that our government does not have a holistic approach to try and stop climate change. I also learned the real reason as to why carbon tax does not work. Namely, it is a regressive tax, meaning that less well-off people pay a proportionally larger amount of their income in tax. Most people simply cannot afford to change to a more expensive, environmentally friendly alternative. That led me to conclude that other action is required. A final key point that I discovered is that there is actually a huge gap in the market when it comes to retrofitting. And if the government decided to explore this initiative, it would, as well as reducing our carbon footprint, provide large-scale employment across the country at a time that the country will probably need it most. Thank you.
Hi everyone, my name is Julia Baratta. I'm a 6-year student in St. Andrew's College and I won the Central Bank of Ireland Award at Young Economics of the Year 2020. I'm here to describe this experience with this competition and hopefully give you some good and interesting insights. The project I presented is called Pandemics and the Economy, How can Central Bank Respond? I analyze how major central banks reacted to the world economic crisis that happened in the wake of the COVID-19 epidemics in China. How complex and interconnected world economies and supply chains are, and how central banks can act to support demand and production through the monetary channel. As soon as I started studying it, I developed an interest in economics and now is my favorite subject. I am particularly interested in finance, in monetary policy, and central banks. These are the subjects I would like to study in university next year. Guided by my passion and nudged by an economics teacher, I decided to participate to Young Economics of the Year. I mainly use Bloomberg articles, other newspapers, then I use Twitter to ask to different economists their opinion about the topic. I looked to different academic websites and started reading research in the field in the form of newspaper, in form of paper written by academics. I didn't understand much at first, but as I progressed with my research, something clicked and I started understanding some of the issues that matter in the field. I wanted to understand as much as possible the issue and the dynamics in place. In order to do that, I had to ask for help everywhere I could find it. I kept asking questions to my teacher and to all my friends and relatives that had a degree in economics. I asked why, and then I asked why again at every step of the explanation until each step was clear and I couldn't be boiled down to a slide. Some of these people started to hate me, but in a good way. I then organized my acquired knowledge in a clear PowerPoint presentation. And in future, I see myself working in finance as an analyst at a large investment bank or in a research department in an international organization. Thank you for listening.
My name is Phelan O'Cahuil from Coláiste Oriel in Monaghan, and I was the winner of the PDST Young Economist of the Year in 2020 for my project on the sustainability of index funds for equity markets. I knew before taking part in the competition that economics was something that I wanted to pursue at third level, and so I've been on the lookout for any extracurricular activities that I could take part in that were related to economics so that I could improve my CV and develop my interest in the subject outside of school. When I first heard about YEOTY, I knew straight away that it was something that would be worthwhile to get involved in. I played around with a few different ideas for topics for my project, but I eventually settled on my chosen title after reading an article from the famous hedge fund manager Michael Burry from the film The Big Short. In the article, Burry, who was one of the first investors to predict and profit from the subprime mortgage meltdown in 2008, said that he believed there was a similar inflation and distortion of prices happening in the stock market today due to the massive shift to passive index funds among investors. I decided that this was a topic that I wanted to pursue further, so I started to do some of my own research. Most of the research that I conducted involved reading academic papers and reports from different researchers and banks. I also did some primary research by gathering data online and evaluating this to look at statistical relationships between stock prices. For me, the hardest part of the project was trying to refine and select the most relevant information for my project from all the vast swathes of information that were available online. Working on the project definitely helped me to develop my research skills, and I feel that that's something that's going to stand to me as I move forward into third level education. As part of my prize for winning YEOTY, I was part of the Irish team for the International Economics Olympiad in 2020. This was supposed to be held in Kazakhstan, but ended up being held online due to COVID-19 restrictions. This was a brilliant opportunity for myself and all my teammates. We had the once-in-a-lifetime chance to compete against top economics students from all across the world. And the entire experience was capped off when myself and two of my teammates were awarded bronze medals for our performance.
Thanks Tom, Juliana and Phelan. So a Young Economist of the Year is a very prestigious award in its own right, but it also can be a stepping stone to represent Ireland in the International Economics Olympiad. So I'm going to introduce you now to Pat Egan, who mentored the IEO Irish team last year, who's just going to give you some insights into this competition.
Hi, my name is Pat Egan. I have been involved with the Irish Economics Olympiad team over the last 2 years. The first occasion was when we travelled to St. Petersburg, 2019. This year it was held remotely from Kazakhstan. This summer we started off with 8 students from as far south as Cork, as far north as Derry. Each student submitted 2 exercises per week based on ECN 101, Normal Economics. They sat one econometrics lecture, while on Sundays they spent probably 4 to 5 hours of their day practicing for the business case study. This was made all the better by guest appearances from AIB, Ben McDonald from UCD, as well as the Central Bank. But I suppose one of the biggest parts of it was the Brazilian team, who are the current world champions. They came along and helped us and gave us lots of advice. It stood to us. By September, 5 of our students entered the Olympiad as part of our team. 1 student entered the open track. The Irish team reached the business case study final, eventually finishing 5th. It was such a highlight. 3 of our students, yes 3, were in the world top 30%, which meant that they achieved bronze medals. Over the last 3 years, students qualified for the Irish team by submitting the best projects to YEOTY. This year, all YEOTY entrants over the years who are still in secondary school will be in with a chance to make the Irish team. I've recently set up an Instagram page, ECON_O_IRPL. More details are to follow. I want next year's team to emulate the achievements of this year's team. If you've got a student who's willing, more important than ability, who's willing to learn, I want to know about it. Finally, I wish to thank Rachel for unending support in the promotion of economics in Ireland. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Pat. Thank you also for your work with the IEO team throughout the summer. I'd also like to take this opportunity to thank all of the partners involved in the PDST Young Economist of the Year. Without your expertise and financial support, the Young Economist of the Year and the Irish team attending the International Economics Olympiad would not be possible. We hope to continue our partnership with you long into the future. We are now coming near the end of the webinar, and I'm just going to finish up by giving you some information about how you will submit your projects and how you will access resources that will help you and your students in the design and development of your projects. We are working on a submission form for you that will be available in January. Now, that submission form will require you to include details like an abstract and some keywords and which of the Sustainable Development Goals are referenced in your project. It is a requirement that every project must reference at least one of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. So you don't have to tick a box to say which special interest category you want to submit your project to. All projects are submitted in a general submission form, and then each of the partners will go through the abstracts and through the keywords to see which projects are of interest to them. So you may be considered for more than one award, but we will work together as a team then to ensure that there's a fair distribution of prizes across all students. So that is the submission of prizes, and that is how you will be considered for the various special interest awards. The second thing is that if students are going to take part in producing or working on an inquiry-based project, we do have a list of criteria that we do use to inform the judging of the submissions. So that rubric is also available on our website, youngeconomist.ie. This year, we want to make sure that we don't lose sight of the fact that some students can design some very creative resources to help in the understanding and enjoyment of economics. So we are going to have a special interest award for creativity. So we've had some lovely projects in the past where students have created their own cartoons and they've created raps and poems and songs. So we want that to continue as well, and we will judge those kind of projects separately to the inquiry-based projects because obviously they have a very different approach and they require different judging criteria. So I just want to signpost some resources that you may find useful. So we have discussed in previous CPD days the economics of climate change. So those resources from last year's CPD day are on our website, youngeconomist.ie. We've also flagged a very useful resource called the Core Economics Resource, and that's a free resource to teachers. So if you go to the Core website, you can apply to have access to this free resource, and we would highly recommend that. And another resource that I've come across recently is the Economist Foundation. And I don't think you necessarily have to subscribe to the Economist magazine to access this resource. So if you go to the website that's shown here, you will be able to register for this resource, and it actually has some very useful and very accessible resources that you will be able to use to provide stimulus for your students. So there are just some ideas for you and some resources that might help you to work with your students and develop some very interesting projects. So I'd just like to finish up now by saying that we're very, very grateful for all the work that you're doing with students, and that this competition is growing stronger every year because of you and because of your enthusiasm and because you're inspiring students to take part. So it's brilliant to see this happening, and it's brilliant to see the interest among students, and it's actually great to see then students themselves going on to study economics, and hopefully they might come back as judges sometime in the future. So I just want to say thanks to all the people who contributed to the webinar this evening, and I hope you enjoyed it. And all I'd like to say now is that we hope that you enjoy good health and stay safe during these very uncertain times, and we hope that you get to enjoy some downtime with your family over Christmas. And we look forward to seeing all the entries coming in the new year, and we look forward to the awards ceremony that will be online at the end of April, and further details will follow in due course. So thanks very much, and slán.